Now to today's sermon. I love the graphic. Thank you. That's really cute. The font is fonting. Um, when I was thinking of the title for today, I had another choice. Now, my first instinct is, or the thing on the shoulder over here that's like, do not tell them that other choice. Like, keep that to yourself. But then this part of me over here is like, well, how will they ever really understand me if they don't hear the other choice? But I need to build up about 5 pages of courage, and I'll tell you at the end what the other choice was. Can't give it to you yet. But I chose to go with this title, A Table for Two. For the last couple weeks, I have listened, I have wept, and I've watched as we collectively and maybe individually have looked at statistics and polls and read news to hold everybody else accountable in one way or another with how we got here. I read the Federalist Papers, a few of them this week. Like, I was just trying to see, when did the problem start? Was it Alexander Hamilton after all? I have really been searching for a solution, and I think instinctually or instinctively, it was not me, right? I've answered more than I would like to have, more emails, texts, and calls where people are saying, what now? What about my children? What about my family? What about my access to care? What about my body, my choice? But the hardest question has come from pastor colleagues. Colleagues that wonder what the line is between the good news that we are mandated or called to share and the not so good news that we can't exactly ignore. Before I responded, my first thought, as it usually is when people ask me hard questions, and I'm like, did you ask Jesus? Because I don't know. But my first thought always, is this a fruit question or a root question? Now, there are people that ask questions, and it's a fruit question, right? It's a question about what to do with this thing that is manifested. What do we do with this temporary or with this external situation that's happening? But that's not my job. I'm not a fruit inspector. I'm a root inspector. Because then the root questions are those questions that are deep, those questions that if you actually can get to the bottom of that, might possibly change the fruit. And so what's next? What do we do? How do I do? What about my medical care? All of that. Good questions. How do we preach the good news in times of turmoil and all the other words that you can put in there, because I can't think of none right now? Great question, but it's a fruit question. The root question is, how do we hold the sanctity of community while ensuring that people recognize their individual responsibilities? What is our role as believers? How have we been complicit? How have we contributed? Are we doing enough on the other side of things? Maybe we haven't been complicit, and here is a spoiler alert, some way or the other, we all are. Black, brown, gay, straight, there are areas where all of us, upon deeper investigation, can find ways we become complicit in system, because the system needs that individual contribution. So in my mind, the answer to all of the questions was, well, what does God require? What are we being asked to do? I remember being a teenager, not too many years ago, and a show came out on MTV in 1992 called Real World. The show featured 7 cast members from 500 applicants to live in this 4,000 square feet Soho loft. For 3 months, you found out more than anyone should know about anyone's life. It is credited with launching the modern reality TV genre, rightly or wrongly, however you may feel about that. The show was a hit. It gave us characters and cast members or people like Pedro, who was a gay activist and advocate who died shortly after the season premiered, but we learned so much about living with HIV and AIDS. It gave us Kevin Powell, who is a prolific writer. He wrote for Vibe magazine, has wonderful books and poetry, has been featured in the New York Times and Washington Post. And it gave us Karamo Brown, who is on Queer Eye, which I also love, a different reality of sort, but also has the Karamo show. So all these people, and many, many more, were on this show. But what I remember most about the show, and what I thought about this week, was the words that were over top of the opening sequence. So in the background, you would see all these clips and you would hear this music, and then you would hear these 7 distinct voices. And it would say, this is the true story of 7 strangers picked to live in a house, work together, and have their lives taped to find out what happens when people stop being polite and start getting real. The real world. Fantastic. So what do you think about when you hear that last line? What happens when people stop being polite and start getting real? Back then I thought it would mean what happens when you move past the niceties of strangers. People can hold their breath for at least the first 10 minutes of meeting someone, you know? You could be on your best behavior. I used to tell Sammy this all the time. You could be on your best behavior for a little while, can't you, dear? And that little while varied. You know, it was very subjective. But I was younger then, and I was already well-versed in masking and people-pleasing as a survival mechanism. As I grew older, began working through trauma, therapy, embracing who I am, which is still a process, the tagline hits different. When I examine that, what happens when you stop being polite and start being real through the lens of respectability. Respectability meaning this idea that marginalized people have to conform to dominant norms or behavior to be deemed worthy. It's rooted in white supremacy and white-bodied supremacy. It's like, oh, you're not gonna like that example. You know what? Well, yes, I'm gonna give it anyway. It's how I feel about grammar police, right? You know, someone will make this profound, well, as profound as it can be, wise post on something or write something or share something, and instead of addressing the thing in it, someone will say, well, you said there and should have said there. Or didn't you mean to instead of to? It's your, not your. It's then, not then, like those little things. And I get it, like some of us are deeply bothered by those little things. But it's the policing of it. And this idea that this grammar or this particular attribute, this cultural norm has to be changed, or you have to do something different to fit in with dominant culture. This idea leads to things like code switching, or this idea of performance. Because that's how I see the line now. I don't see it as what happens when people stop being polite. I see it as what happens when people stop performing and start being real. I perform the roles expected of me because the stakes of getting it wrong were too high. But performance is exhausting, and it's dehumanizing. It demands conformity at the cost of authenticity. It robs us of our ability to connect deeply with ourselves and others because we're obscuring our true self. The more you perform, the more difficult it becomes to separate who you are from who you've been told you need to be until the mask cracks. We are in a cracked mask era. And at some point, the weight becomes too much to bear, and you have to confront what is being asked of you, not by this world, not by the systems, but by God. What happens when we stop performing and start being honest? In Micah 6, 1-8, the prophet delivers a message that cuts through all of the nonsense. It cuts through the pomp, the pageantry, and the performance. In this text, it starts with God bringing a case against Israel. What have I done to you? Reminding them of the covenant relationship that they should share. God makes it clear, I'm not interested in your burnt offerings. I don't need these extravagant displays. This is not a recital. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? The question is kind of deceptive, though, because it makes it seem like, what does God require of you? And sometimes I think we expect this big, long list. these things that are hard or difficult or seemingly impossible. But no, instead we get the layers stripped away. Micah is saying it's not about looking the part, sounding the part. It's not about impressing others. It's not a public appearance. It's a deeply personal one-on-one conversation with God. It's a table for two. The only audience is God. What does it mean to sit at that table and hear God asking for justice, kindness, and humility? Not for a public display, but an act of covenant. I think we become so conditioned to live as though someone's always watching. We are it's like the Truman Show, like our very own show where you don't know what the show is and what the show isn't. These days you send a text and sometimes you have to think twice because you don't know if it will be screenshot and sent to someone else. You send an email at work and wonder, are they going to misread my tone and forward this to someone unattended? Now I know you may be like, Pastor Shana, you sounded a bit paranoid. But in this day and age, sacred does not mean the same thing to everyone, and privacy does not mean the same. Our phones and our technology are ever tracking. If I say right now that I want a rug, by the time I get home, I'm going to see 10 ads for rugs. And that can be helpful sometimes, but still, it's a violation. But when you sit down at the table for two, all of that fades away. There's no script, no performance, no one to sway. It's you and God and the call to live authentically in divine relationship. I thought about it this week and I'm like, people always say, oh, I'm not playing checkers, I'm playing chess, to show how deep in strategy they are. We see reports of some of the strategies that we may come to expect as 2025 comes into view. And I get it. Sometimes this world can feel maybe so unreal that it's like a game. Moves, counter moves, performances calibrated to win favor, likes. I think that's why watching dystopian young adult novels has been my self-care for the last couple weeks. I was telling someone earlier, yesterday's choices were Ready Player One, The Giver, The Uglies, and Ender's Game. All of them based on books because I make up random rules for the things that I do, only for myself apparently, but they were all based on books. Ender's Game is by Orson Scott Card, and it is like a huge series of books. There's like 17, 18 of them. It's fantastic. They're so good. But last night, Ender's Game, Ender Wiggins, he's this brilliant child prodigy in a dystopian world where the Micah aliens have tried to come and take over Earth, and they've defeated them one time. So now they're training kids because they realize that children process data and analyze quicker than adults. So now they're training these kids through these simulated battles to lead humanity's defense against alien invasion. Ender is so good. He is empathetic, he is compassionate, he is strategic, he is tactical. What a blend, right? He thinks he's playing the game and he gets to his final test. In this final test, he's like, all bets off. I mean, he's like probably 13, 14, but he's like, I got this, this will decide if he can graduate from command school and lead the fleet. He goes into it with his friends Petra, Bean, and Dink, and Bernard, and they win. And they're celebrating and they're excited. And he's like, oh my God, I won. Like, yes, we did it. Take that. He throws his little skinny children arms in the air and he's flailing and so excited. Until he realizes that it wasn't a game. That in that moment, he had destroyed a whole species. The alien species he thought he was defeating was annihilated. Ender is crushed. He is shattered. They put him in a pod. They promoted him to admiral, put him in a pod, and sent him on his way with a little special piece of cargo that you got to either read the book or watch the movie to find out. And actually, I won't do that to you. If you want to know what happens, you can ask me after church, and I'll gladly spoil it. But the illusion of the game is broken, and he's left to grapple with the enormity of his decision. Ender's story mirrors the dissonance in our current social climate. Just as Ender thought he was in a game, but that game had irreversible consequences, Micah's call reminds us that our pursuit of justice, kindness, and humility carries profound, tangible stakes for the world we're shaping every day. We live in a world where the line between reality and performance is blurred. We see debates and decisions formed as wins and losses with little attention paid to the real human cost. It can feel like the stakes aren't real when the suffering is distant, the consequences abstract, and the players disconnected. But as with Ender, the choices we make in this perceived game have real-world implications. When we reduce our justice to #justice, or our kindness to performative justice to be posted on social media, or our humility to strategic moves or false senses of humility, we risk losing sight of the truth that all of those things shape our world. Micah's words now are just as urgent as they were then. We see it every day that performance has taken center stage. And it's not just in politics, it's in our faith communities, it's in our jobs. We see people performing outrage, performing virtue, and even apathy for an audience. Look at these last 2 weeks. If we look at our communities of cares and all the people who said what they were going to do, and then we look at what happened, there's a dissonance there. Somewhere between the booth and the buffet, something got lost. But here we are, in the midst of some who celebrate, some who have lamented, others who chose not to engage. But we all have the same question: what now? Micah's answer pulls us back to the essence of what now. The essence of being in covenant with God, doing justice, loving kindness, walking humbly. Acts of the heart lived out in relationship. We quote them all the time. Everybody knows them. I even got a t-shirt at MiddleCon last year with the words on them. But how do we move from the quote to actually doing it? How do we stop echoing them like it is a play or a recital and using them as instructions to deepen our relationships? Justice here is not about grandstanding. It's about working to right wrongs. Kindness here is not about that surface level niceness. It's about deep, abiding care for others. Humility here is not about self-deprecation. It's about recognizing that we walk this path with God as our God in our everyday lives. Sitting at this table with God means letting justice, kindness, and humility shape even the small things, the small interactions, the small decisions. It's choosing to speak up when you see unfairness. It's taking the time to check on a neighbor or lend a hand to someone in need, not because it's expected, but because you're moved by compassion. It's pausing before responding in anger or judgment, and instead offering the grace that you would want to receive. It's about finding opportunities to let God's values interrupt your routine, allowing ordinary moments to become sacred by reflecting the love and care that God is calling us to embody. When I first thought about this sermon, I considered calling it Queering Micah. I hesitated, not because I didn't want it to be that, but because I wasn't quite sure how it would be received. By queering, I don't mean taking Micah to to the drag show or inserting LGBTQIA identity into Micah's narrative, but rather reading the text through an anti-establishment lens, pushing beyond the constraints of tradition and institutions to really sit in what this prophetic call means in this raw, unfiltered reality. Queering Micah is Micah calling us out of performance. Queering Micah is not a message for the establishment. It's a message for the people, for you, for me, for anyone that is willing to sit at that table, for anyone who is willing to answer the call to that reservation and have an honest conversation with God. At this table, there's no requirement for masks, no space for pretense, no need to perform. It's not about what the world demands. It's not what tradition says. It's not even what you think will get you the most applause or that thing that you think will get you an extra crown in heaven. God requires something real. Justice will cost you something. Kindness will stretch you beyond what you could imagine. Humility will challenge every part of your core being, but in that is where it begins. Not this endless cycle of performance, but in the bold act of becoming. So today, as I wrap it up, I invite you to your own table for two. Take Micah's question with you. Be mad at it. Be disappointed about it. Wrestle with it. Set it down, but then pick it back up. Ask yourself what justice looks like in your context as a lived reality. Ask how kindness can become the heartbeat of your relationship. Ask what it really means to walk humbly with God, not for show, but for real. And when you sit at that table, remember this. God is not asking for perfection. God wants your presence. God doesn't require performance. God desires your heart. May we all have the courage to stop being polite, to stop performing, and to start getting real, not just with ourselves, but the one who has loved us, instructed us, called us, and walked beside us all along. May it be so.